This is the start of podcast number 4 for Chapter 10 on lesson planning. An important part of writing lesson plans is to write objectives or lesson objectives. There's 3 parts to an objective. Actually, the student will is part of it, that's the actor. But then we have 3 major parts. The behavior, what is expected of the student. In the motor domain, that might be verbs such as strike, hit, or pass. A condition is the situation under which the behavior is exhibited. In other words, how is it that they are going to practice that behavior in your lesson? And then the criterion or the assessment of the objective is added at the end usually, but not always. The performance level that's expected of the student to be able to accomplish that objective. In other words, making 8 out of 10 shots, practice for 5 minutes, those kinds of things. Very rarely do we ever say, do something 100% of the time. Not even professional players can do something 100% of the time. Here we have some examples of behaviors in the 3 domains: the psychomotor domain, the affective domain, and the cognitive domain. Some examples in the motor domain or psychomotor domain are shooting a basket, performing 20 curl-ups, defending, kicking, running, dribbling, following through, contacting, throwing, catching, and so on. In the affective domain, some of the verbs are cooperate, encourage, volunteers for something, assist with something. In the cognitive domain, it could be verbs like recall certain facts, identify certain things out of a list, apply certain concepts to game situations, analyze skills, evaluate skills, or create skills or routines in a lesson. They are all on different levels of higher order thinking skills. Those levels are represented and named and titled in the document I gave you earlier on that compares the taxonomies. Harrow's taxonomy of the psychomotor domain, Bloom's taxonomy of the cognitive domain, and Krathwohl's taxonomy of the affective domain. A sample lesson objective in volleyball is the students will be able to pass the volleyball to the center front position, which is where the setter is, using a legal forearm pass from a ball tossed over the net. The behavior is using a forearm pass. The condition is, or conditions of practice are, pass a tossed ball from a ball tossed over the net. And then the criterion, how you're going to assess it is it a legal pass or not? The behavior component of a lesson objective is written as an action verb that describe what the student is to do. And again, those are in the 3 domains. And again here we have some other examples of behavioral verbs that go with the domains. As I said before, the taxonomies are important that I gave to you before, because they describe different levels of cognitive thinking or affective behavior or motor behavior. For example, in Bloom's cognitive taxonomy, knowledge is the lowest level of cognitive performance. Several verbs from that particular level are identify and list. It's the simplest part of comprehension. Comprehension is the second level, and the verbs for that one would be things like recognize and compare. Application is the next most difficult level. Application obviously would be applying things to or concepts to other things. Analysis is breaking down into parts. Synthesis, the next to the highest level of cognitive thinking, would be like making defensive strategies or offensive strategies in a game. And evaluate is the highest level of Bloom's cognitive taxonomy. That would be doing things like officiating. It's inherent in these taxonomies that you are able to do the lower levels of the taxonomy when you reach the higher level of the taxonomy. The condition component of the objective, it describes the situation or the environment in which the action will be performed. Specificity is critical for this because this condition component is what we use to try to figure out if they are able to practice and apply that skill effectively in a game situation. How does one work cooperatively or demonstrate knowledge? You have to be sure that a condition helps to describe how they're going to do the behavioral performance in each of these objectives. You use the conditions to design practice tasks for the lesson. Basically, if you write a good lesson objective, I should be able to tell exactly what you're doing in that lesson by just looking at the objectives. The criterion component of the objective is the assessment level of performance or minimal performance of the objective. It must be measurable. The evaluative criteria indicate when success is achieved. There might be a quantitative product or a number that is on the objective, getting how many trials out of how many trials, or doing something for 30 seconds or whatever, and that's the evaluation or the assessment part of the objective. It could also be a qualitative type of criterion when you're looking at the process or the characteristics of the movement. It might be the degree of understanding, the extent of cooperation, or consistent movement. Those are all qualitative criteria. Lesson objectives should be specific enough so that there should be no question about what the learner should know and be able to do by the end of the lesson. The importance of the detail is that it helps teachers plan appropriate instruction and evaluate student learning. It also helps us supervisors to know exactly what it is that students are supposed to know and be able to do at the end of the lesson. All learning outcomes can be described and are measurable at all levels of planning. We need to be able to observe every lesson objective that you have. Understanding is not something we can observe. Knowledge is not something we can observe. You've got to describe a behavior in your lesson objectives. Learning is enhanced when teachers make detailed objectives. The objective at the bottom of this slide is incomplete. The student will be able to field softballs. What does that tell you about what this objective would look like in a practice situation? What does it tell you about how a teacher is going to be able to assess whether the students have accomplished that objective or not? So what you would have to do is add some things to this objective to help clarify and be specific about what you want the student to know and be able to do. Examples of inappropriate lesson objectives would be when teachers haven't thought through the content and provide no direction for evaluation, have a lack of conditions to describe the context or the task to be learned, the practice conditions for the task, and or a lack of assessment criteria for performance. The objective is literally useless in these cases. So the three parts of a lesson objective are a behavioral verb, a condition to practice with, and an assessment or a criterion to assess whether you've accomplished that objective with your students or not. This is the end of podcast number 4 for Chapter 10.